Okay, hello and welcome to I'm That Witch, the podcast about all things witchcraft. Or is it? We have witchcraft so ingrained in our culture and pop culture that we think we know all there is to know, but what we want to do is look back at historical witches, historical alleged witches, and really look at who they were as people and what that means for us as modern witches.
Welcome to the first episode of I'm That Witch. I'm Maddy.
And I'm Bridget.
And before we get into our first episode, we'd like to just introduce ourselves to the audience. So my name is Maddy. I am a good friend of Bridget's, and she is the one who really introduced me to witchcraft in the beginning. She is a practicing witch, which she'll tell you a little more about. I've never practiced witchcraft. I don't know a lot, which is why I'm here learning alongside her and excited to speak about different supposed witches from history. And I will say that I am interested in the paranormal, and that's why we got along so well when I first met Bridget, because we would talk about ghosts and ghouls and all that fun, funky stuff. So, yeah, I'm just very excited to share these stories with you. As a fan of history, I think that this will be a great project to reveal, who are these supposed witches from history? What are their backgrounds? Which Bridget will kind of explain a little bit more of where this project got started as the originator of this idea.
So, as Maddy was saying, I'm Bridget, and I am a practicing witch, and have been practicing off and on since high school, but consistently for, I would say, about the last 10 years, and a lot of my witchcraft journey has come from things that I learned in my childhood from my family members who did not identify as witches, but still carried a lot of intergenerational practices that correlate with what's historically kind of viewed as witchcraft. So even though my family was more along the religious lines rather than the spiritual aspect of it, a lot of the practices were passed down from my great-grandmother and through the generations, and I was very close with her. So it's kind of become that sort of situation, and when we first started talking about making this podcast, it started off talking about, let's just talk about historical witches, and I think it took both of us kind of doing a little more research into these historical witches that we all have come to know and love in pop culture and things of that nature to realize that a lot of them really have been categorized under this umbrella of witchcraft that were not, typically not really witches, which is something that it's something that I think that we kind of knew to a degree because, we think back to Salem and how many women and men, but especially women in high numbers, were accused of witchcraft just for being too loud for polite society or for being different, for owning property, things that were really just obviously not actually witchcraft. But the more we dive into so many of these people who were labeled as witches, the more I think that we've both kind of started to realize that there's a lot more to dig into there. And so yeah, I think that a really big part of the goal is to dig into who these people were as people, and also I'm really interested to see how that affects modern day practicing witches like myself and what it means for our craft and the way that we label ourselves.
Yeah. And with that, let's jump into the first episode.
Yes! Okay. Yes! So our first episode, we are going to talk about Bridget Cleary. And I first heard about Bridget Cleary on an episode of Lore when it was on Amazon Prime or what have you. And I was very intrigued by the story. Not just because we share the name Bridget, but it just was very interesting to me. And I know that it's been probably covered on other podcasts, other TV shows, things like that. But there's also a lot of really interesting information I found about her online, like in historical documents. And that's something that I think is also kind of rare about a lot of these people that we'll probably end up talking about, is like some of them are very well documented and others are more like myth than anything, you know what I mean?
Yeah, there's not a lot of documentation of the people we cover over this series, so apologies in advance if we don't get the facts exactly right. The facts aren't exactly established for a lot of these figures throughout history, so we're taking what we can from like the most research that's out there, but obviously there's a lot of different stories of how these people live their lives.
Yes, exactly. And the interesting thing I found about Bridget too is that I feel like a lot of times, even when there is documentation about an event or like I say like specifically a woman's life, it usually like starts after she's married or after she's gained notoriety. And like the really cool thing about Bridget Cleary is because this at the end of the day is a criminal matter, her early life is pretty well documented for a woman in like the 1890s. So yeah, with that being said, I'm going to talk about Bridget Cleary, and she is widely labeled as the last witch burned in Ireland. So content warning, I don't know if this is necessary, but I would like to say that there is content warning for domestic violence. She definitely after a certain point in her life, faced a lot of physical and psychological violence from her husband and other members of her family, as well as murder is another content warning by quite violent means, and maybe a little religious trauma in there. I'm going to sprinkle that content warning in too for some of us who have that. So I'd like to start again.
Yes, I'm not looking at
with a little nursery rhyme that summarizes the aspects of the very tragic story of Bridget Cleary, and it is, are you a witch, are you a fairy, or are you the wife of Michael Cleary? And honestly, it sounds strange, but that kind of, even though it's short and out of context, it really boils down what her story and the tragedy of her life and death turned into. So Bridget was born Bridget Boland in February of 1869, and she was born in, please forgive me, all of you Irish folks out there, Ballivadley?
Question mark?
My ancestors are crying somewhere. They are weeping in shame. Anyway, Bridget Cleary was born Bridget Boland in February of 1869 in, please forgive me, Ballivadley, Ireland. And she had by all accounts, two loving parents. And when she was quite young in her adulthood, or maybe late teen years, she went to a place called Clonmel and studied as a seamstress's apprentice. And this was apparently kind of unusual for somebody of her, I guess, status. She was not documented as being wealthy by any means, but she did seem like she had a pretty stable family and didn't necessarily have any reason to have to find work. But Bridget was documented and known by her friends and neighbors and family members to be a very independent woman, very ambitious, and she wanted to be able to just, I guess, go out and kind of have that freedom. So she studied as a seamstress's apprentice, and while she was there in Clonmel, she met who would become her husband, Michael Cleary. Michael was a cooper, which my brain immediately was like, chicken coops? But it turns out that a cooper is somebody who makes like baskets and barrels. Do you see?
I was thinking of a cobbler.
Like
I was like, isn't that shoes? You dumb bitch.
Isn't that?
I'm just the dumb bitch. I don't know if I can say bitch. Anyway.
No, it's fine. We'll keep it in. It's fine.
It's not okay. So it's baskets.
basket, yeah, or like barrels, like putting together barrels.
What a simple life. If only all our lives could be that simple.
Can we go back to that? Just, making barrels and being seamstresses apprentices, raising chickens. But that's not what a Cooper is, as it turns out.
Exactly. So they meet.
And after a month of getting to know each other, they get married. So,
Damn.
Yeah. Let's not go back to that part of the simpler life.
Yeah, true.
We'll leave that part there. But no, after about a month, they get married, and because Michael has to continue working in Clonmel, Bridget goes back to live with her parents for a short time during the beginning of their marriage. And so they kind of have to have a long-distance marriage for just a short amount of time, and during that time, Bridget starts her own business as a seamstress, and she also raises chickens and sells eggs, and she gets kind of a lucrative business going for herself. She's earning pretty good money for her and her family, and getting herself kind of established in her community. Everybody knows her, and according to a lot of accounts from neighbors, like, people knew her as being, like, it was unusual that she had that sense of independence, but they also knew her as being, like, quite loud and outspoken, like, being kind of gaudy, like, like, she wore jewelry, and she wore, like, nice stockings, and, like, things that I guess were not typical for a wholesome married woman at the time.
Yeah. By 19th century standards, no.
We can see why they're calling her a witch. Although at that point, no one really called her that. So her mother passes away, and Michael is finally able to move to Ballybadley, and they move in with her father, and then they're able to get a brand new kind of house because there was a government program at the time that a lot of land was being shifted around. It was kind of an unstable time in Ireland, and like with like relations between Ireland and England, like there was just a lot of weird turmoil and shifts going on. So they were able to get a house that was meant for laborers. Now, Michael and Bridget did not fall under the category of laborer, but Bridget's father, Patrick, had been a laborer prior to his retirement of sorts, or his old age, and so they were able to get this house. One thing that is noted is that this house was allegedly built on top of an old fairy fort. And this is where we get into the mythology. So we're going to take a little sidestep out of realism and get into this idea of fairies. So in Celtic sort of history and older times, we get these stories of fairies, and they could be kind, they could be benevolent. That's a word, benevolent. Or they could be malicious if you were not careful. But mostly they were just kind of tricky. But a lot of times people got into saying, like, the fair folk or the good folk because you did not want to insult a fairy. Fairy forts, or sometimes fairy rings, are thought to be a sort of portal between our world and the world of fairies. So usually you would see it as like a presumably naturally occurring perfect circle. So like mushrooms growing in a circle, or rocks that are formed in a circle, or trees that form in a circle are thought to be portals to this other world where the fairies live. Along with this myth of fairies comes the myth of the changeling. So changelings were thought to be fairies that had been exchanged for humans. And the reasoning behind this kind of digs into, I think, a lot of history of ableism, which is interesting, and ageism as well, because it was thought that fairies had a very big focus on beauty and perfection, and when one of their own was imperfect in some way, perceived to be imperfect in some way, that they would exchange them out for a human, typically a human baby or an elderly person. And it's interesting because a lot of times people would assume that their loved one had been switched out for a changeling because their loved one was acting in some way that was unbecoming or like not typical. So there are a lot of modern scholars that theorize that it was used as an explanation for young children with autism. And like, you know, they're meeting typical developmental milestones, and then they get to a certain point and all of a sudden those developmental milestones are not being met, or there seems to be some quote-unquote regression, and they did not have the terminology for autism spectrum disorder at the time, and it wasn't really seen as something that was acceptable or understood, and so, well, this isn't my baby, this is a changeling. And the same could be said later in life for adults who were accused of being changelings. Oftentimes it had to do with either an unexpected physical illness or mental illness. So that's really where ableism kind of plays into it. And that is what ended up happening with Bridget. So there is one winter, I believe. It was March, I believe. March. So it was the tail end of winter. Still quite cold and frigid in that area at the time. It was March of 1895. And Bridget had to go out and deliver some eggs. She went to the person's house that she was going to be delivering the eggs to, and they did not answer the door. They weren't expecting her that day. It was freezing. She was like, man, it's really cold, but I'm going to wait and see if they come back anytime soon. So she kind of just milled around and waited in the cold. And they never came, so she just had to go back home. She told someone later, she told Michael later, her husband, that like whose house she had gone to, and that person also happened to live near a fairy fort. So it comes into play a couple different times in this. When she gets back, she goes to warm herself by the fire, and she just cannot get warm. It's freezing. And she very quickly becomes sick. They call for the doctor 3 different times, and he isn't able to get there until the 3rd time that they call. So at this point, she's been sick for probably like 5 days, and finally the doctor gets there and diagnoses her with bronchitis, and she is so ill by that time that they call in a priest for last rites. They think she's going to die. But the doctor still gives her some medicine, tells Michael, the instructions of when to administer it, because he's got to do all that he can do. Over the next few days, Bridget is stable. She's still sick, but she's not on the decline like they thought she would be. And for some reason, Michael got in his head that this was no longer Bridget. The story goes that he had a friend come and visit because a lot of friends and family members were coming in to say goodbye to Bridget just in case, or to check on her and bring them food and whatnot as they were struggling through her being sick, especially because she was kind of the primary breadwinner at that point because of her lucrative business, even though Michael was still working. And I guess one of the friends came in who happened to be an expert on fairies, which is a completely logical thing to be. He's an expert on fairies. PhD. He's got his PhD in the fair folk. He takes one look at Bridget and he takes Michael's eye and he's like, yo, bro, this is not your wife. That is a fairy. That is a changeling. You've got to do something about it. And Michael's like, yeah, sounds legit. I noticed that she's about an inch taller than my wife, and she's just far too pretty to be my wife. Or
dang.
I know, he was like, what a slight. She's an inch taller and she's too fine is literally like the words that he used, which to me, I'm just like, she's too fine. I'm sure that's exactly how Michael Cleary spoke in 1890s Ireland.
But even more of an insult, because she definitely looks like absolute garbage while sick with bronchitis and about to die.
Right on her deathbed.
So not only is she prettier now, but also prettier on her deathbed.
I know. Oh my god, it's so sad. Poor Bridget. I mean, it's only gonna get worse. Don't worry, it gets worse.
Bridget.
So Bridget. Speaking about Bridget, after a very obvious outfit change on both of our parts, definitely had some technical difficulties. So we're gonna try and pick up where I left off, and this is why we take notes. Anyway, so I was getting ready to talk about what happened after Bridget was accused of being a changeling. So we already kind of talked about how there's some domestic violence that's depicted here. I personally would like to kind of just do a brief summary rather than going into all of the gory details. The details do exist out there because it was a formal murder charge, and the case was so well documented. But for me personally, I feel like there's already so many depictions of violence against women in media, and obviously it's a very real thing that happens to many women in life still today, and I want to be respectful of that. I don't want to pretend that it's not happening or that it didn't happen, but I also feel like I want to focus more on like the heart of the story, like the outcome of what happened, rather than like all of like the nitty-gritty details of the terrible things that she went through. Mm-hmm. And I hope that's okay with everyone watching and listening as well. I just want to like give that disclaimer before I do the rest of the story and someone's like, you didn't tell us what happened.
Yeah, and I think we, like, anyone can respect that, you know, that's how you choose to tell the story, and if someone wants to look into it, they can go and research it themselves as well.
Yeah, and it's definitely well documented, and I know other podcasts have even covered it. There have been, like, episodes of TV shows and things, and then, like, in actual, like, historical documentation. I will cover, like, the basics of what happened. I'm not going to just like kind of brush over it completely, but I want to focus more on the outcome of what happened to her essentially. Mm-hmm. So essentially over the course of several days, Bridget was subjected to what can best be described as torture on at the hands of her husband and several of her other family members. This consisted of being denied medication, because as you may recall, she was very ill, on her deathbed, you could argue. So she was denied medication. She was hit and slapped in specific ways. She was force-fed. In some cases, she was force-fed things like bitter herbs and urine. She had urine thrown upon her, and just overall underwent a lot of very like psychologically damaging things as well at the hands of her husband, who was repeatedly accusing her of not being his wife and of not being human.
And do we know what family members are participating in this torture?
So, the primary person was Bridget's husband, Michael. Her father, Patrick, allegedly also participated. And then there were also several cousins who were indicted in these charges as well, specifically Mary and James Kennedy, and I believe Patrick Kennedy there was another Patrick involved who was a cousin, I believe.
You can't trust him. Wow. I mean, that's crazy to think that your own family would turn against you like that.
It's wild, and there are so many implications really too in all of this that I'm gonna like get into here in a moment. But essentially it all kind of comes to a head or culminates in Bridget is somehow feeling well enough to get up and come out to the kitchen or the place where they would dine at the table. And she seems to be in pretty good spirits. She seems to be like doing all right, and she comes out and she just really wants something to eat. So one of her family members brings her some bread and some tea. But unfortunately, her husband has one last test for her. She has to eat 3, like, I don't know if it's bites of bread or pieces of bread, and in between each one, she has to answer truthfully with who she is. She has to be able to say, I am Bridget Cleary, wife of Michael Cleary. And allegedly, if she can do this, he will believe her. However, he doesn't give her anything to wash the bread down with. And so I know, like it's like you don't want to laugh because it's such a terrible situation, but also I'm like, dude, just like forcing that dry ass bread down her throat.
He knew what he was doing.
He knew.
I mean, you think about like saltines.
Oh my god.
When you eat too many and you're
just like, yeah, like, and she had tea right there waiting for her too. Just
see, underlying it, you would think that he's doing these things because he knows that at one point she's going to crumble.
That is very much a thought or a theory or a feeling that I have. And it definitely plays into some of the theories of how all of this was even allowed to happen. But essentially, she's able to do it twice. She gets 2 bites or pieces of bread down. She says who she is, and she can't quite choke down the 3rd piece of bread. And so from there, the stories of the witnesses who are in the home with them kind of vary. One person says that she tripped and fell into the fire. Another person says he was holding her over the fire, telling her that if she needed to say who she was, and then she accidentally caught on fire. And another story is that he pushed her down, doused her in kerosene, and lit her on fire. Either way, unfortunately, Bridget Cleary, after days of torture, at the hands of her husband and her family, was murdered and died by being burned alive. So they took her body out and they buried her, and it wasn't until people kind of noticed, like, hey, we haven't seen Bridget and we haven't seen, the Undertaker come get her. I know she's been sick. Like, where's Bridget? Mm-hmm. And apparently at this point, Michael had also kind of gone missing. And police came. Somehow they found out what happened. I believe they were able to talk to family members, and the family members kind of crumbled and were like, okay, here's what happened. And they got these various accounts of her last moments, and they were led to her body. They found her body, and now they're just like, where is Michael? Michael was at the fairy fort. He was sitting in the fairy fort where he believed, allegedly, that now that he had killed the changeling, his wife was going to be coming home to him anytime at this fairy fort. And he had been sitting there for days, waiting for his wife to come home. So there's a lot to unpack there. But in the end, there were 9 people initially charged with Bridget's murder. 5 ended up being formally indicted. And I have a little note here because I wanted to make sure I had this part right. But Michael himself was found guilty of manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He served 15 of those years, and then he immigrated to Canada.
The home of serial killers.
The home of serial killers.
Is it not?
I don't know. I was told it was Ohio, but
I mean, the border's right there. Well, wait.
No, not quite.
That's not how that works. I mean, it's just it's a little lake in between.
Well, we also have the state of Michigan.
I just remember, like, thank God I got through high school. Like, thank God I don't have to go through that shit anymore.
Listen, I don't want to acknowledge Michigan either because I'm from Ohio and we have a notorious rivalry.
Oh, it is below. Mm-hmm. Oh, damn.
Yeah, Michigan.
But like,
right?
What's the? Don't y'all isn't Ohio right next to a lake?
No, the lake.
One of the 5 lakes.
Yes. Okay. No, that's true. So one of the Great Lakes is by Cleveland in the north of Ohio.
Yeah,
I believe. Yeah.
So he could have hopped the ferry.
Possibly.
Don't ask me geography questions.
I'm embarrassed that I don't know this. And do you know...
We need a map.
The really sad thing about the fact that I'm like, oh yeah, like, Ohio is by one of the Great Lakes. Cleveland is by the lake. Do you know, the only reason I know that, it's because we call Cleveland the mistake on the lake. I'm sorry, Cleveland. I don't mean
They're coming for you.
Listen, I come from Springfield, home of the Simpsons, so I have no room to talk. Just gonna throw that out there. This is taking a wild left turn.
I know, I'm sorry. We gotta get back down to business.
No, you're good. It's
back to Ireland.
Back to Ireland.
Which, if you told me to find where Bridget Cleary was from on a map, absolutely not. I think I was trying to find the graphic for this, and I'm like, where did you say she's from again?
It's probably because the way I was trying to pronounce
Probably. So, back to what you're saying.
Yes.
4 people got out of charges. They're like, nah, I was just there to watch.
Yeah, it was a spectator sport.
Spectating.
I
didn't participate.
It is so wild. And so, there's a lot of implications here to unpack. And historically, it ends up being a situation of really big significance for a few reasons. So I'll start with Michael's state of mind or reasoning. There are so many theories about why the hell he did this, right? So we of course have superstition. Did he really believe that his wife had been replaced by a changeling, a fairy changeling? Was that a superstition that he actually bought into? Was it some sort of mental illness? One of the biggest comparisons that it gets is this syndrome, I believe it's pronounced Capgras syndrome or Capgras syndrome, essentially where someone believes that their loved one has been replaced with an imposter, which is a terrifying thought, like for that to be reality or for you to like be in a state of mind where you believe that would be such a scary thing. So there's theories that maybe he was suffering delusions. Yeah. And then, of course, there is good old-fashioned misogyny. Bridget was a very, prominent and, like, loud sort of figure. She was very strong-willed. For a while, she was the breadwinner in the family. She had a successful business. She was a young woman who was married and didn't have kids, and that probably made people talk. So was he then falling prey to societal pressures or his own ego of having a wife who was not subservient to him in those ways? And unfortunately, we never find out. We have no idea. He doesn't really give us a motive. He just says that I believed my wife was taken by fairies. And that's just a really kind of tragic aspect of it. One thing that is very interesting that came from it, though, is that it also kind of held a political significance, her death, because it was used as kind of like cannon fodder for anti-Irish propaganda. So at the time, Ireland was still a colony of England, and they were being ruled by the English crown, and there was this whole kind of back and forth of whether or not Ireland should be allowed independence from England. And this specific case was published far and wide across that area as a reason for Ireland should not have independence, because look at these backwards people. They are so superstitious, they lack all logic, they're savages, etc. They're willing to kill their own wives in such a brutal way because of a silly superstition. How unhinged, which arguably, that's pretty unhinged, although obviously not a reflection of the Irish people as a whole. But in that way, Bridget's death was sort of weaponized against her own people as a form of political propaganda, and that is still talked about in educational settings today, which is really interesting. All in all, that is the story of Bridget Cleary, and she's considered the last witch burned in Ireland, or the last witch killed in Ireland, even though she really was not accused of witchcraft. So.
It's just so tragic. I think especially considering how her family is complicit.
It is incredibly disturbing, and I like this.
Because even if he is, suffering from delusional disorder or whatever, specific delusion about her, but he somehow convinces the whole family, oh no, you also need to participate.
Right, and then it comes into
and they're like, okay, girl.
And then it comes into play of, were they scared of him? Was it a shared delusion? Was it a folie à deux, but, en masse type of situation?
Do we know what the other family pled to, or if there was an outcome in terms of, are they also charged with manslaughter, or...
I don't even know if I wrote it down. I know that the other 4 individuals who went to trial, I believe they were all found guilty of lesser charges and served shorter sentences, ranging from a short prison sentence to hard labor.
Dang.
So they all, to my
something along the lines of conspiracy, or
to my knowledge, or to my recollection, they and I hate that I wasn't more prepared for this. I promise my next
I'm so interested.
My next one I'm so I'm got really in depth on, but to my knowledge they all faced some sort of consequence, but I can't help but be low-key a little disturbed by the fact that that Michael Cleary ended up in Canada, and my brain is racking itself of do I know which of my ancestors immigrated here? Oh. The answer is I do know that the grandfather's name who came here allegedly from Ireland, with a very scarily, would like to say for the record, scarily similar last name of Mick Cleary.
And how do we know they didn't change it?
Right. Okay, so
it was the first name Michael.
His first name was Eli. I would say that. Eli
also could have been changed.
Eli McCleary could have been changed. So anyone who is really into genealogy, if you know the outcome, did Michael Cleary come down from Canada to Ohio, change
through the little lake,
through the little mistake on the lake, and change his name to Eli McCleary and fight in the Civil War for the Union? Thank God. Would like to say,
gang.
Thank you for that.
Really represented. Really represented there.
I cannot tell you the level of panic I experienced when my grandmother was like, oh yeah, and he fought in the Civil War, and I was like, for who?
For who?
Please, for who?
Relief.
I should have probably guessed the answer because Ohio, but You never know, man.
You never know.
The scary times.
Let's just say we're from parts of the north where it looks a lot like the south. Just saying. Just saying.
It's like, this could go either way. This could be a toss-up, but anyway.
Well, thank you for such an awesome story, and thank you everyone to listening to us.
Yeah.
This is our first episode that we're finishing, and you'll hear me present in the next one. It's a work in progress, we'll say that.
I appreciate your patience, Maddie, and any listener patience with the fact that I had enough technical difficulties that we had to come back in a completely different like light and outfit and day of the week and be like, anyway, this is, I think, where we were.
Exactly.
I'm pretty sure everybody faced consequences.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you liked what you heard, if you made it this far, you can find us on Spotify. The podcast is I'm That Witch. And this has kind of been a fun little project that we're starting in relation to my business, which is Love Witch Spells. So you can find my website, lovewitchspells.com, and you can find us featured on Instagram at Love Witch Spells and on TikTok at Love Witch Spells 13.
Awesome. Bye, guys. Bye.
I'm That Witch is researched, written, and hosted by Maddie Guerra and Bridget Golden, edited by Bridget Golden. You can find more episodes on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your podcasts. You can also find us on social media on Instagram at Love Witch Spells or TikTok at Love Witch Spells 13. Make sure to like and subscribe if you liked what you heard today and want to hear more. Thanks for listening.